Well, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, or whenever you're tuning in to the Growing Our Future podcast. You know, we just love having guests on this show just so we can say, hey, listen to what they have to say. There's probably an apple or a nugget of gold there that if you'll plant it, it'll create great success into the future. Today is no different. We've got a recognized figure, many people know him. I mean, he talked on a television show one time, 8 minutes, about a pencil. A pencil. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Dirty Jobs himself, how things work. We've got Mike Rowe. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Aaron, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm going to try and come up with some, what'd you call it? Nuggets of gold.
Nuggets. We want them. I've got an idea for our podcast. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but I have a feeling that as you hear the questions and how this unfolds, you'll know where I'm going with this.
All right.
Number one, I know that your website is outstanding, your bio, everything is great, but we've got a younger audience and they tend to do things on Snapchat and Instagram and in very short bursts. So a lot of them may not take the time, but a lot of them are going to be sitting in a classroom and I want to introduce them to Mike Rowe. So if you would just take a moment and give us a little background of your career and how you got to where you're at today and the exciting things that you got coming up in the future.
All right. Well, the short version is I grew up on a very small farm in Maryland in Baltimore County, next to a magician who also happened to be my grandfather. And when I say a magician, I don't mean he could pull a rabbit out of a hat. I mean, he could build, fix, or repair anything, but blindfolded. He just had that magical chip, in the back of his head. He only went to the 7th grade, but by the time he was 30, he was a master electrician and a carpenter and a steam fitter and a welder. And he built the house I was born in without a blueprint. So I grew up next to a true tradesman on a small farm. And so I was very, very lucky from a young age. I had a front row seat to the kind of work ethic that I think everybody values or everybody should value. And I had a real appreciation for the kinds of jobs that make civilized life work for everyone. Unfortunately, Aaron, as I discussed in Texas not too long ago, that gene, that handy gene that so many lucky people get is kind of recessive. And I wasn't able to do the things that my grandfather did, the things that came to him so naturally. I struggled with. I worked as his apprentice for most of my teenage years, but by the time I was 17, it was pretty clear that I was not going to be following in his footsteps, much less filling his shoes. So he was a guy who said to me, Mike, you can be a tradesman. Being a tradesman is just a state of mind. But you ought to get yourself a different toolbox. And so I did. I went to a community college. I studied a lot of things that I didn't really think I would be interested in, including acting and writing and singing, narrating and hosting shows, and way leads on to way, And so I got out of community college. I went to work in my chosen field. Then I went back to school for a little longer. And then I started hosting these little local TV shows, and one thing led to the next. And then there was a fateful day. I was 40 at this point when my mother called me to tell me that my granddad, this guy I'd grown up next to, this magician, was 90 years old. And she said, Michael, your grandfather's not going to live forever. Wouldn't it be great if before he died, he could turn on the TV and see you doing something that looked like work? So that's really what happened to me, Aaron. After working in entertainment for 20 years, freelancing, doing all sorts of different shows, putting together a new toolbox, I got that call from my mom, and I worked out a pilot for a new idea called Dirty Jobs, and the Discovery Channel bought it. And that was 20 years ago, really, this month, 20 years ago. And so I really never stopped. I've been working as an apprentice for the last 20 years with men and women who do the kinds of jobs that make civilized life work, essential jobs, essentially. And that's become my life. That show defined me. I've worked on lots of other projects since then, but that show is still in production. I started a foundation that awards work ethic scholarships in memory of my granddad. And so really, I'm super fortunate today to have TV shows that I can still work on that I care about, and that a foundation that I think is making a difference, and opportunities to come and talk to organizations like yours about some things that I think are really important to our country, which is celebrating all jobs, getting more people trained for jobs that don't require a 4-year degree. Nothing wrong with a 4-year degree, but as you've heard me say many times, we have over 11 million jobs in this country that are open right now. And most of those jobs, they don't require a 4-year diploma. They require training. They require men and women who are willing to get up early and stay late and distinguish themselves on the job and advance through the ranks. So anyway, that's what I do. That's what I'm all about.
Well, I can tell you personally and professionally, I really admire and respect your story. Where you grew up there in Maryland. I've been there a couple, 2 or 3 times. I worked for a member of Congress, and actually carried the Texas flag at National Flag Day ceremonies in Baltimore, Maryland twice. So in the United States, I'm the only person that's carried their state flag twice at National Flag Day ceremonies. Recently, I took my son on a college tour, and we were up on the bay, on the Chesapeake Bay, and I took him by Fort McHenry and shared with him the story of Baltimore and just what a beautiful city, history that it holds. But when I read about your mom and where y'all grew up, and now that you're out on the West Coast, I thought this is crazy how life can take us in all these different directions. Your story, go ahead.
Well, this will blow your mind. I was back in Baltimore a week and a half ago.
I saw you
and
on
I
Facebook.
stayed down in the harbor, and I took a walk through South Baltimore. And for some reason, it was a beautiful morning. I just kept going. I walked to Fort McHenry. And I know the Rangers there. I've done several shows at Fort McHenry, and I walked out onto the ramparts and looked across the bay toward Francis Scott Key Bridge, right where the ships were anchored when Key wrote the national anthem. Yeah, it's important. I think it doesn't matter where you live. There is a Fort McHenry everywhere.
Oh man,
there's a geography and an importance and a permanence to where we grow up. I don't care if it's Texas or Tallahassee. And part of fostering a real appreciation for the country we have and the opportunities that are in it is to really understand your own zip code first. And that's always been important to me. And it's funny you should say Fort McHenry, because that's my backyard.
Well, I'm going to tell you, there's nothing like being at Fort McHenry and watching the video about the Star Spangled Banner, and to understand what a real Star Spangled Banner is, versus what we think a Star Spangled Banner is.
No kidding.
And to see that those curtains open up and there's that Star Spangled Banner, I'm going to tell you that it's a proud moment. And,
well, that flag that still flies there, they can't put it up on windy days because it's so big. If the wind really takes it, it'll pull the whole pole down. But it must be half the size of a football field. I folded it with some guys. Took us about 3 hours.
Well, your story and your work ethic. I love the fact that you're full of ideas. I tell my kids all the time, I said, what's wrong with a good idea? Nothing, Dad. I said, yeah, it is. If it's the only one you got to have a lot of good ideas. And so that's one thing that I've admired about your career, is the fact that you're always being creative and you're thinking about what ifs. And that's what we need kids to do. We need y'all to be thinking about what if. It doesn't mean that everything's going to work, but don't ever let that imagination slip away. Always be thinking what ifs. The work ethic, growing up like I did at Cal Farley's Boys Ranch, I look back on my 4 years at Boys Ranch and all of the jobs that I did, moving irrigation pipe, working in the hog farm, in the feedlot, bucking hay, in the slaughterhouse. And you've met me. I'm not a big guy by any means. And imagine that they didn't cut me any slack for all that. I had to step up like everybody else. The other thing about your career too is I appreciate what you do with the Boy Scout Skills USA, and then obviously with FFA. For me, the FFA was the game changer, because when I put that jacket on, I looked like everybody else.
Interesting.
You didn't know that I came from a broken home, or that we got our dinner out of a garbage can, or how much money I had in my checking account, or what my test scores were. What the jacket did was level the playing field and gave me an opportunity. And that's why I say that the reason I appreciate what you do is because when you encourage and you empower those kids, whether it be in FFA or Boy Scouts or Skills USA, that could be those comments could be the very catalyst for that aha moment for a kid to say, I've got to have an idea. I've got to have a competitive edge. I got to get to work. And by the way, I'll feel better about myself if I do work, by the way. So that's why I say that when you share your story and your pathway, I hope that no matter if we're talking about kids or teachers or sponsors, I hope they hear that path you've been on, they may find themselves on.
They might. And, the thing is, Aaron, it's got to be very confusing, to be 16, 17, 18 years old today, because it's very confusing to be 30, 40, and 50 years old today, too. Everyone, it seems, is very, very certain about what they know and what they believe. And we're surrounded by people who are telling us, no, not that way, this way. Or no, not this way, that way. No, you don't want to do that. You want to do this. And there's a lot of what I call cookie cutter advice that's out there. And I've learned personally to be a lot stingier with my advice than I used to be. And what you just said is really important to me. The only thing I'm really qualified to talk about, and I've come to this conclusion, relatively recently, and it'll sound obvious when I say it, but the only story I'm really qualified to tell is mine. I can help tell stories of people with dirty jobs, and I can tell you stories about people my foundation has assisted. But if this conversation were to wind up in a classroom one day, I'd be very careful about what I said to everyone, because so many people need to hear different things at different times.
Right.
Like you just said,
Right.
when you put that jacket on, it's probably not so different than when I put on the Boy Scout uniform for the first time when I was 12 years old.
Yep.
I was at a point in my life where I needed to belong to something bigger than me. And I needed to join. I needed to conform. I needed to be part of a team. But you'll also know, too, that there are times in your life when you need to distinguish yourself from not just the rest of the world, but from everyone around you. And so how do you know when to encourage someone to be different, to take chances? And how do you know when to encourage someone to step back from themselves a little bit and be a part of a team? Baseball teams and football teams are very, very interesting metaphors. You can look at them and you can see how powerful they become as a result of coming together. But look a little deeper and you'll see the quarterback might be paid a little something different than the linebacker, or the pitcher might be getting paid a little differently than the left fielder. So life is about living inside of these teams and inside of classrooms and our whole country, right? It's a melting pot. We have to come together. We have to assimilate, but we also need to be proud of who we are and the zip code where we came from, because that's part of our story too. So that's a long way of saying there's a lot of good advice out there, but it's very, very hard to know exactly what everyone needs to hear at one moment in time.
Tom Ziegler said one time, we were talking about his dad, the great Zig Ziglar, and he asked his dad, he said, Dad, he goes, how come every time you speak, you tell your story? And he said, son, he goes, every time I speak, there's somebody that hasn't heard it. And there's also somebody in the audience that's at a different place in their life that they need to hear it now. It's exactly what you just said. I tell the kids here in Texas, you think about it, there's over 3,000 high schools, I think, in the state of Texas. They all have graduating classes. So they're all going to be out there looking for a job, a scholarship, or an opportunity. So I always ask them, I said, what's your competitive edge? What have you done to give yourself a competitive edge? And that's the reason why, again, that what you share is important, because what you say today could be the very thing that for that kid ignites them to find that competitive edge.
You know what I love that you said, Aaron, earlier? It's, you know, sometimes instead of advice, what people really need to hear, myself included, are those two words you uttered before. What if?
What if?
What if? What if you showed up
Hmm.
15 minutes early for work
Yes.
for a month?
Yes.
What if you stayed 15 minutes late? What if you resolved to start every day by embracing the fact that you've already won the greatest lottery of all time? You're alive. It's a miracle. You walk the earth. You live in the greatest country ever formed. What if you start every day by saying, I don't know what's going to happen to me today. I don't know what kind of bad news or good news I'm going to get. I have no idea what the cards are going to be, but I have to play them. And I'm going to play them with a fundamental attitude of gratitude. What if you did that? You know, not what if you did it forever, or what if you did it for a year, but what if you did it for a month or even just a week, right? Every good habit that I've ever seen cultivated has one thing in common with every bad habit that I've ever seen cultivated. And they start with the question, what if? What if I slept in?
Mm.
What if I
Wow.
went home early?
Wow.
What if, right? So, you
Mm.
know, those words are super powerful
Mm.
because they frame the context of what follows. And what follows is 100% entirely up to you.
I love it. We've only got a limited time, but I mean, I feel like we could just talk for hours. I mean, my son was in fourth grade. It was bring your daddy to school day. What does your daddy do? Well, I live in a town where we've got NATO pilots and doctors and lawyers and really cool jobs. And then we got Chandler's daddy. He's a professional beggar. You know, I'm a development officer. You know, that's what I do. And I thought, how am I going to explain this to the kids? And so I went up to the board, and on the whiteboard, I drew a little bitty door. And I asked the kids, I said, how many of y'all could get through that door? And they said, no, sir. And then I drew a really big door. And I said, now, how many of y'all could get through that door? And they said, yes, sir. I said, that's what I do. I make doors bigger. And with that, Mike, what I again appreciate about what you say and what we're trying to do with these kids is our job is to get them to the opportunity. Our job is to make that door bigger, get them to the opportunity. Their responsibility is to determine the outcome.
I think that's all you can do, Aaron, honestly. I think to try and do much more than that. Well, what's the old expression? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You know, you can't force the kid through the doorway, but you can make it bigger, right?
That's right.
And so that's what I've learned. You know,
You're doing it.
I mean,
You're doing it. Your foundation, the promotions, the messaging, what you're doing is you are making that door bigger. We're trying to help you encourage them,
thank you.
but they've got to step out and do it.
Well, and it, you know, I think sometimes we overcomplicate things. Zig Ziglar's right. You get the one story to tell. Now you can tell it 1,000 different ways, and you can tell it to a lot of different groups of people. I hadn't heard it put like that before, but I like it. And that's what I do now. You know, I work on TV shows. I do my thing, but look, I'm not much for trophies, but you guys sent me this.
Wow.
All right.
Yeah.
I love this because it, you know, I'm going to put it on the wall back there because it reminds me of the day I got to tell my story to 8,000 or 9,000 people who hadn't heard it before. And, you know, we were talking before the podcast, and I showed you this. This is a curriculum, a work ethic curriculum that we're going to try and get into high schools. We already have it in some colleges right now. So I'm not trying to change the world. I'm not trying to boil the ocean, but I am trying to make a persuasive case for my story and my trip and my journey. And I'm still on it. You also mentioned my mom. Here, this is a shameless plug, but you know, I always talk about my granddad and my father because when it comes to work ethic, those guys just set the bar up here. That's really what Dirty Jobs was all about.
Mhm.
But the real story of work ethic that was right in front of me the whole time was my mom. This is my mom's latest book. It's called Vacuuming in the Nude and Other Ways to Get Attention, right?
I've heard of
It's
that book.
and you got it right. Now, relax. I'm not going to try and sell the thing, but I'm telling you,
It's
it
great
went to
reading.
the top of the charts.
Mhm.
It's another New York Times bestseller. And my mom's first best-selling book came out when she was 80. 80. This woman, for as long as I'd known her, wrote every day for 60 years before a publisher paid attention. And so, we can talk about hard work and we can talk about persistence and we can talk about dreams and following your passion and so many other things that are really important to all of us. But we need examples in our lives of people who actually walk the walk. Dirty Jobs is a collection of those examples.
It's good.
Every show I worked on
It's
is
good.
a collection of those examples. But, how much credit do I really get for that? I don't know, because I I grew up with a front row seat to the hardest working father I'd ever you could imagine, the smartest grandfather you could ever hope to have live across the lawn from you, and a mother who didn't have to lecture me ever about the importance or the virtues of working hard. All she had to do was live and let me watch her. So,
Wow.
look, what the FFA does, providing those kinds of examples, you know, it's it's critical and it's really the best thing you can do.
Your mom, I got to tell you, I think I mentioned to you before we started that, I've watched y'all interview, and I admire the way your mom looks at you, and I can tell how proud she is of you. And maybe on a personal note, the reason why that means so much is I remember as a kid coming home from school early and my mom's car was in the yard and she shouldn't have been home. I remember working my way to the back of the house and my mom's bedroom door was cracked and I could hear on the other side, and I eased the door open. I get my height from my mom. She was a tiny woman. And there was my little mother on the foot of her bed on her knees. And I tell you, when she was wailing out, Mike, I'm telling you, my mom had tears coming down her face. She was wailing out to God because we had no food. And she said, God, would you please just bring my son something to eat? God, would you please just provide for us? But the words that I never forgot is she said, God, would you please just give my son an opportunity? Okay. Years later, my oldest son, his name is Chandler, after the guy that raised me at Boys Ranch, we're working in a mission, an orphanage in Chihuahua, Mexico. And I asked the lady that ran the orphanage, I said, Sister, what do you need? Food, clothing, medicine, what can we help you with? Sister, what is your prayer for these children? And she said, Mister, I just pray that these kids will have an opportunity. The reason that what you do is so important is because you're kind of like, go back to Zig. They always said Ziegler was the purveyor of hope. In a world that seems hopeless, it's nice to have people that come along in our lives and they share their story, which I've always been told there's two things you can't argue with: the Bible and somebody's testimony. And your testimony is pretty powerful. So to your point, the people that are listening, they might find themselves in there somewhere. And the fact that we've got people that are encouraging them may get them through that door. One of the things that we teach in our ambassador program is we always tell people that the essence of leadership is to plant trees under whose shade you may never sit. That is the essence of leadership. And I believe that's what you're doing. Your foundation, your presentations, you have no idea what the effect of that's going to be. I mean, your inspiration could very well cultivate the mentor to my granddaughter or to my grandson. That's why I appreciate what you do.
Thank you. I look at it like a pitcher who lets go of the ball. Once it's out of his hands, it's out of his hands.
That's right.
There's a whole lot you can do while you're holding on to that thing. The way you stand, your approach, I mean, everything, But the minute you let it go, it's gone. It's funny. I asked my mom about this book after I read it. I said, are you worried at all? You've written a book that basically shows what can happen if you never give up, if you never quit. But I said, does it worry you that somebody who doesn't have your talent might read this and say, that's it, I'm going to spend the rest of my life studying to be an opera singer or a ballet dancer? Or, what if your dream doesn't match up with your ability? See, that's what happened to me, Aaron. I dreamt as a kid. I was sure I was going to follow in my grandfather's footsteps. I was sure I was going to get the skills that he had. And when I realized that those two things don't line up all of the time, that's part of growing up, right? And that's painful to learn.
Good.
That's why I'm
Yep.
careful with advice. And that's why I asked my mom, I said,
Yep.
how do you want people to think about you?
Mhm.
What is it you're really trying to tell them by announcing and showing to the world that after 60 years of writing, you finally succeeded? And she thought about it and she said, Mike, that's a good point. I don't want to tell people that they can do it simply because they want to do it. But what I want to do, and this is a word you just used that I love, what I want to do is I want to encourage them.
Mm.
Encouragement. It's kind of like cheerfulness. It yields dividends that you might not ever see. And so I said, well, what exactly do you mean? Give me the right metaphor. And she said, I want people who read this book, aspiring writers, aspiring artists, people who haven't realized their ambition or their goal just yet. I want them to see me as one of those people who stand along the line of a marathon, holding cups of water
Yes.
for the thirsty, exhausted people who are running by, still pushing. That's my mom. She wants to be the person who holds out a cup of water for you and a smile and says, good luck, right? And that's it. That's really, I think, all we can do in this crazy time of influencing and social media and so many people with so many ideas and so many notions. We can encourage people to try. We can encourage them to say, what if?
Yep. Okay. Gosh, well, I'm telling you, we could talk for hours, but I know we've got to wrap up. Okay, so normally when we do this podcast, there's a question I ask at the beginning, but I've saved this one to the end. And you've really answered it probably 2 or 3 times, but I'm still going to ask it.
All right.
Because I really appreciate the fact that you have such a heart for gratitude. And that is, Mike, what are you grateful for today?
Well, look, I mean, it'll sound a little glib, but I'm grateful for this conversation. I'm grateful for the fact that we live in a time when we can have this conversation when there's 1,000 miles between us or more. I'm grateful for the people who keep the fiber optic cables running and who keep the grid online. Look at this miracle. Look at these wires. I mean, this was unthinkable when I started my career. And here we are, a couple of guys who met in person a few months ago during an event. And now we're each in our offices and we're pushing the conversation forward. I'm grateful. I think you probably said it better than I will. You plant a tree that will create some shade that you might never sit in. That's not a thing to bemoan. That's not a thing to say, oh gosh, I'm going to miss out on the shade. That's a thing to be grateful for. That's part of a legacy. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to build something with the time I've got on the planet that will outlive me.
I couldn't have said it any better. I tell the same thing. I live in a great country, full of opportunity. I've got a job and I actually have a little bit of money left over at the end of each month. And the reason that's important is because I might be able to help somebody else. So I get to work with kids. I told Tom Ziegler, I said, I'm in the kid business. I said, the kid business is the future business. I said, I love what I do because it's really about the future. So having guests like you join us again we're hopefully planting seeds of greatness that somebody's going to hear and say, man, if Mike Rowe can do that, wow, maybe I can do it. And it might not be like you said, I went to college, I was going to be a meat cutter and then an ag teacher. And now I'm ended up as a foundation director. I mean, you got to be nimble. And what is it, what was it, the story about the young employee asked his manager, he said, what's the secret of success? He said, you just jump when your opportunity comes along. And he says, well, how do I know it's my opportunity? He said, you just keep jumping. And, you've done that.
Since farming has basically informed this whole conversation, I'll leave you with this. It just occurred to me that, I'm in the broadcasting business, but broadcasting, that's an agricultural term. That's a farming term.
That's right.
I didn't know this, but when I first stumbled across it, a farmer on Dirty Jobs told me. He said, yeah, the word broadcasting originally meant the way in which seeds were planted. Not carefully,
right?
Just one row at a time.
Mm-hmm.
You just cast them out.
Right.
And when you broadcast, you know, you don't always know what you hit. You don't always know what's going to grow and what's not going to grow. And that's the terrifying thing about it and the wonderful thing about it. You don't always get to know. But as a broadcaster, what can you do except grab another handful of seeds, toss them into the wind, and hope for the best?
That's awesome. That's
awesome. You can take it. Give it to give it to Tom Ziegler.
Yeah, I'll tell Tom about it. Hey, last question. It's always a fun question. So the last question I like to ask is, what's the best concert you ever been to?
Wow. Oh, that's very, very tough. A couple years ago, I was working on a show called Returning the Favor for Facebook. And I wound up in New Jersey, worked all day. And then I learned that the Eagles were playing in a stadium just down the road, along with Steely Dan and the Doobie Brothers and Joe Walsh, who was, of course, with the Eagles, but then he also did his own thing.
Right.
So I wound up going to this thing, got tickets with my business partner, and we sat there about 5 rows back. And what made it so great was the fact that it was both old and new at the same time. It was familiar. I knew all of the songs, and I was blown away by how much they sounded like they did on the old albums. But to see all of those groups together, I'd never seen that before. And it was one of those weird occasions where it wasn't just the music, it wasn't just the company. It was things that, the weather. It was just a perfect evening. It was the food, everything. It was just a great night, and the music was just one part of it.
So here's another connection for you. You mentioned the Eagles. Ag teacher by the name of Shorty Hagler, great guy, by the way. Shorty and I became really good buddies. Shorty had a kid in his ag class named Don Henley.
No kidding.
So Don Henley is a Texas FFA member from East Texas. And so here again, here we are because of the FFA.
Isn't that funny? Well, Don Henley happened to be the favorite musician of all time of a guy named John Hendricks. John Hendricks is a guy I met years ago who had a crazy idea to change TV. And he created something called the Discovery Channel. And when John turned 60, he hired Don Henley to come play at his thing. And I had a chance to meet Don. But I got one more for you, too. As long as we're talking about the Eagles.
That's awesome.
22 years ago in Phoenix, they did a concert. And this was, talk about the weather. This was so strange. We were all coming in, and the seats had been set up. There were hundreds of folding plastic chairs, and then there was this series of bleachers behind us, and the crowd was coming in, and it was overcast, and then it was dark, and then these like dirt devils and wind started blowing. I've never seen such wind come out of nowhere. and it blew the chairs all over the place. It blew the big posters on the stage off. It completely trashed the place, and it happened so quick, and then it was over. And then the sun set underneath all these black, weird clouds, and it lit up the sky. I swear, Aaron, it turned it purple and pink. I've never seen a sky like this.
Wow.
And in the midst of this incredibly odd, unanticipated beauty and devastation, out on the stage walks Joe Walsh. And somehow his guitar is still in its holder and still plugged in on the edge of the stage. And Joe walks over, puts his foot under the guitar, and kicks it up in the air. He catches it with his left hand and starts playing the beginning chords of Hotel California. On a dark desert highway, in the midst of all of this strangeness, and everybody just sat down where they were and watch these guys put on a clinic. It was amazing.
That's epic right there.
Yeah. I just gave myself goosebumps. That might be the best concert now that I think about it.
Well, listen, Mike, there's no question that there's a lot that you have on your agenda that you could do. I want to tell you how much I appreciate you taking the time. I know that our audience will. I know that our teachers and our students and our sponsors, they just can't say enough of how much they appreciate how you poured into our kids at the convention. And I appreciate you taking this time to share a little bit more with us and let us introduce you to even a little bit broader audience. We're going to broadcast this message.
I'll take it.
Again, thank you so much. Again, everybody, when you watch the Growing Our Future podcast, it's all about planting seeds of greatness. If you want to know what the future is, grow it. And that's what this is about. Let's grow a better future in our communities, in our state, and in our country. And it's guests like this that give us the tools to do that. Thank you, Mike Rowe, for joining us.
Anytime, Baron.